Today is the really big question, which is when a person calculates how much he's supposed to tithe, what does he deduct? So we talked about, certainly everyone agrees you can deduct business expenses, but what about deducting living expenses from, when it comes time to tithe? There is a statement made by the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. Kama yitein ha'adam tzedakah, shana rishona this is in Kitzer Shulchan Aruch Siman Lamed Daled. How much should a person give to tzedakah? The first year, you look at all of your assets. In other words, when you say your first year, I guess you're in your bar mitzvah. You look at how much you own, and you just take 10% of that and you give it to tzedakah. Mikan va'elach yitein ma'aser min harevach sheherviach kol shana. From that point onwards, you give a tenth of all of your profits, right? Any additional income that you gain, but you don't have to tithe what there's no double taxation. You don't have to tithe what you've already tithed from. And then he writes, chutz mitzorchei beso, except for the needs of your household. In other words, you deduct your household expenses before you look at how much your net is on an annual basis. Tzorchei beso, of course, is a very vague term because it basically means, well, household expenses could usually refer to rent, heating, utilities, food, repairs, clothing, etc., etc., etc. By the time you're finished, you're usually either in deficit or break even. So that wouldn't necessarily require you to tithe anything if you look at the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. But then a person has to be honest. How much of what I list as household expenses are luxury items, right? Vacation time and buying myself a fancy new car, etc., etc., etc. So there are times that if a person were to be honest, even if he were to go according to the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, he would say, listen, I can either tithe my assets or I can buy myself, the nice new car or the expensive suit or whatever it is, and I'm going to try and tithe instead. In the footnotes, the author of this Choveret had cited Rav Vosner in Shevet HaLevi. So he writes as follows. He says, "Begeder nikoi hotzos umasim yeshnam kama derachim." When we talk about deducting your expenses and taxes that you have to pay in order to get to your net profits for the year, there are many different ways to do this. Yesh hasovrim shemenakim in harevach kol hamasim be'ein hevdel bein mas karga u'mas hachnasa u'sharei hamasim. He says some say that you can deduct all taxes, right? Whether it's a head tax, an income tax, a sales tax, all taxes that you've paid over the course of the year, you can deduct from your net profits and then just tithe what's remaining. V'chein le'inyan hotzaas habayis, and similarly, when it comes to household expenses, das hakneses hagdola, simin reish memtes, the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, and it's the das of the Knesses Hagdola, which I actually did not copy for you, but it's clearly the opinion of the Kitzer that we just saw together. She'ein tzarech lahafrish meiser rak mima shenishar achar hotzaas beso, that you only have to tithe what is remaining after your household expenses. Umechashvim zeh kefi hotzaat minimalit. Now, how do you calculate your household expenses? You have to look at your minimal household expenses, meaning basically, what do I need in order to live from month to month or from week to week? What is my food bill? What is my clothing bill? What is my utility bill? What is my rental bill? What is my home repair bill? And you have to be somewhat honest about it and come to some kind of calculus about what your minimal household expenses are. Your necessaries, your automotive expenses and so forth. Ulederech zeh mitzvahs meiser kesofim davar kalhu ve'efshar lahargil atzmo bekalos. He says if you use this method of calculation, you're going to end up with your 10% of your profits being a very small amount. It's going to be a very minimal amount of money. And this is a very easy thing for a person to do. So in other words, even if a person has difficulty parting with 10% of his income, but if you use a calculation this way, it shouldn't be hard to be able to take 10% of your profits after all of your household expenses have been deducted. So, but then he says, Birkei Yosef hisigal zeh, but the Birkei Yosef disagrees with this psak. In other words, he feels the darko lahoros, the darki lahoros, but he says, what I generally tell people is the bali parnasa ketanim umadchikim atzum l'kayim mitzvos meiser ksafim yasu kehakneses hagdola. He says, what I tell people is that if you're not a person of significant financial needs, and you're just trying to live hand to mouth on a weekly or monthly basis, then you have every right to be lenient like the Knesset Hagdola. V'yoridu hotzos habayis. And therefore you do have a right to deduct household expenses before you calculate how much you need to tithe for tzedakah. Aval, balei parnasa gedolim, yachmiru lechatchila keharbir Yosef. But people who are of a more significant parnasa, who have the ability to put away money in their savings, so they should be machmir like the Birkei Yosef. Ba'ayin gamkein b'da'as Torah lahagon Mahar Sham bazeh, and I refer you to the Mahar Sham as well. So Rav Wosner, contrary to this author, right, who is providing us with like a very, very short synopsis, this author is very machmir, the author of the Hilchos Tzedakah that we're learning now. He's very machmir, and he wants to tell us basically there's only one way to go, and that is you can deduct business expenses, but you cannot deduct household expenses. And one of his sources is Rav Wosner, which we're going to see the next paragraph in just a second. But he neglects to tell us that Rav Wosner says that if you're a person of meager means who's just eking out a living, barely making ends meet, then you have every right to use the calculus of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Now, so what does he refer to when he refers to the Birkei Yosef? We'll see that in a minute. But he says, V'yesh derech sheni, v'hu kinira haskamas haposkim. He says there's another way of making a calculus, which seems to be the consensus. V'chein das nota, and he says, and it's also logical. Shemasim v'hotzoas hamischar. He says that you can deduct taxes and business expenses. Uvichlal zeh gam ma shetzarich lechol o lahalbish atzmo bishvil hamischar v'chein malon. And you can deduct, when we talk about business expenses, you can deduct clothing that you purchase for the business, which means if there's uniforms, or if you need to wear a suit to work every day, which is less and less prevalent, of course, right? But if that, in other words, whatever you need for the business, that you are allowed to deduct. And if you need to, if you're a traveler on business, you can deduct hotel expenses. Unasios and driving, auto expenses. Hakol maridim michiv meiser ksafim kevin shuhu begeder hatzos. That you're allowed to deduct. Aval hatzos habayis shehu ubnei beso ochlim v'shosim v'chem albushim v'chulei. But when it comes to household expenses, which you provide for yourself and your family, for food and clothing, etc., zeh harevach shechayv b'meiser. That needs to be, that's not deductible. And that needs to be the part of the calculus as far as what you take for your 10%. Milvad imachzik orchim o yisomim shepasha sheno chayv la'aser al zeh. But there's also another deduction that you can take, which is what if, as part of your household expenses, you feed guests who are needy. In other words, you have over, you do chesed, you do hachnasas orchim in your house, and you feed guests who need a place for Shabbos. You feed orphans and widows or whatever it is. That you're also allowed to deduct from your tithing lump sum. Okay, so even though that's a household expense, but if you're doing mitzvahs with your household expenses by spending money on doing chesed, so then that you don't have to tithe from. So that's Rav Vosner's shita. He says, and v'yesh gam derech hamachmirim, and there are people who are even more machmir. Shegam b'masim yesh hevdel bein mas hachnasa shehem masei revach shetzorach lahorid me'harevach. He says there are people who are machmir as far as taxes, which we saw yesterday in this Kitzer Sefer that we're learning, that you can't say that all taxes are deductible from your profits. He says there's a difference between income tax, okay? So he says income tax for sure you can deduct. But a head tax or real estate tax, when he says head tax, what it means is that if the government requires every person to pay a lump sum, he says that those kinds of taxes that everyone has to pay equally, or that like a sales tax or things like that, or a property tax, those are not deductible because those are considered to be like debts. He says business, when we talk about what you can deduct, it's like income tax. I make income and I have to take a percentage of my income and give it back to the government. That is as if I never earned it. So therefore, I can certainly deduct that. Amnam kvar kasafti ba'aniye shahaderach hasheni hu derech hamubchar v'nira. He says, but I've already written that kasafti ba'anyi. He says, it seems to me that you can deduct all taxes. That's the way he feels.
So I wasn't expecting it. So I got hit because I calculate for every my weekly paycheck should come out for license. But what happened is I got hit with a big tax bill, more so, I guess there was enough deducted or whatever from the government. So what happens when you get hit or you get a bonus and you get some money? I guess if you get the bonus, you pay on that, you're nicer. But what about if you get and I have to pay now more money to the government? How would that affect?
Well then you can basically pay yourself back.
I can pay myself back?
Yeah. In other words, you can basically say I've overpaid, I've overtithed, right. And so my next tithing period will be 10% minus whatever I've overpaid in my Meiser. Of course you have every right to do that. Sure. Why not?
I just thought of, because once I already calculated and
no, but it was done in error. It was done in error. So you have a right, if you've tithed in error, you certainly have every right to do that. So look, and this is, we have to be very careful with when learning a very terse sefer like this. We don't know who the author is. We don't know what his orientation is. Clearly, he's from Eretz Yisrael, part of the Haredi world, and wants to be very deliberate and careful in the way that he writes the halacha. But you have to understand that according to the Kitzer and the Knesset Hagdola, you are allowed to deduct household expenses. And Rav Vosner himself says expressly, even though he quotes Rav Vosner in his tshuva to say that you cannot deduct household expenses, he says, but he neglects to say that in the previous paragraph, Rav Vosner says that if a person is, let's say, what would we say, middle income, right, or low income, and he's really just squeaking by every month, then he does have a right to rely on the Knesset Hagdola and the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. He also quoted another source which was a tshuva for something that was found in one of these periodicals that brings down Piskei Halacha. He says, this he quotes it from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. As far as deducting household expenses before you calculate your 10%, Kasav Hagrasha Zal b'michtav le'echad mibnei mishpachto b'zeh halasha. Rav Shlomo Zalman wrote the following in a letter to one of his family members. So he says, Kimedumani shekasafti dei barur kedas ha'orach hashulchan. So he says, it would seem to me that I've already written sufficiently on this matter that I go like the Orach HaShulchan, Simin Reish Mem Tes Siv Zayin, She'ein Lanakos et Sotzoas Habayis, that you should not deduct household expenses. Because Shaha'emesu, Kamo Ela Shehishmitu Mehakitzer Shulchan Aruch Simin Lamedalad Sif Dalid, Es Hamilim Chutz Mitzorchei Beisa. And I've also written that I agree with those who have omitted those words when copying the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, except for your household expenses. In other words, there are certain editions, newer editions of the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, that actually just take out those words, those three words, that you take the 10% after calculating household expenses. So after calculating household expenses, those words have been removed from certain editions of the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. And he says that that's correct. He says, I agree that you should take out those words. Now that to me is, that's like censorship. And I'm a little bit taken aback by this. I will tell you that when I searched on my Bar Ilan CD and I opened up the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, those words were missing. And we found it on the Sefaria, and I have my own Kitzer Shulchan Aruch that I got like when I was bar mitzvah, and it has those words in it. Gam, what? Well, this is the whole problem of Hebraic censorship, Judaica censorship. There's a lot been written on this topic, but unfortunately, there are times when a publisher will see something that he's not happy with for whatever reason. It could be from a historical point of view. It could be he perceives this to be a pechisus in kavod Torah, a reduction in the honor of the Torah. And as a result, he will edit out something. This has happened over the centuries to the great detriment of the Jewish people. And it's a very hard question to answer, Ron. It's a practice that's been done by everyone from the shtetl publishers to ArtScroll. Every publisher has taken license to omit certain things that they feel to be something that could be dangerous if it was placed in the hands of the general readership. Who writes a lot about this is Professor Mark Shapiro, if you've heard that name. He writes a lot about this. He actually has a whole book talking about Jewish censorship over the centuries. And there's a lot of juicy examples of this. If there's something that doesn't fit into one's personal religious philosophy that he finds in a sefer, you can just take it out. And I'm saying that, not giving license to do that, but that seems to be the attitude of some people. And it's a problem. It's a serious problem. Gam choshvan, so this letter concludes, Gam choshvani shekasavti lecha, sheyesh amnam deya kazu b'shut avkas rochel, ach lo naktin anhachi. Says it would seem to me that this idea can also be found in Shilas Teshuvas Avkat Rochel, which I did not copy for today, but maybe I should do a little bit more research. But we don't paskin that. In other words, Reb Shlomo Zalman, in a letter that he wrote to a family member, which which basically is not a public psak, but he says that I've already made it my position clear that we should paskin like the Aruch HaShulchan. And the Aruch HaShulchan I did not copy, but let's take a quick look at the Aruch HaShulchan as well. Reish Mem Tes Sif Zayin. We'll take a look in the Sefaria edition. And these are fascinating concepts as far as let's take a look. Reish Mem Tes, which is 249. Sif Zayin, and I'll share my screen. So he says the Aruch HaShulchan states as follows: V'chein hu davar pashut shaharevach mechashvim b'chol shana v'shana me'rosh Hashana ad Rosh Hashana. He says you calculate your profits from one year to the next, from Rosh Hashana to Rosh Hashana. We had seen this already. The im b'shana zu hayilo asakim sheyesh shehirviach bahem v'yesh shehifsid bahem oseh cheshbon klali. He says, let's say you have certain endeavors where you made a profit and others where you incurred a loss. You take the aggregate and you basically see, and you take 10% from whatever is left. Uvichlal revach nechshav rak harevach hanaki. When we calculate how much profit you made over the course of the year, you're allowed to deduct certain things. V'chol ha'otzos shahayalo al ha'esek. He says, whatever expenses you had in order to make your profit, because you had business expenses, you're allowed to deduct. Af ma shenasahu b'derech v'ochal v'shasa hakol nechshav al hotzoas ha'esek u'menake hakol. Even the expenses that it took for you to travel in order to do that business, you're allowed to deduct. Uma shenisha revach acharniki kol ha'otzos mikri revach. Whatever is left after all of those expenses are calculated is called profits. Avol hotzoas beso lo yinake, but you should not deduct your household expenses. V'lachein misha meraviach elef zuhuvim l'shana. So therefore, if a person profits 1,000 gold pieces a year, let's say whatever that is in modern, no sein meya o masayim litzdak, you should give 100 or 200 of that for charity. Af al gav shuhu bal hotza beveso od yoser me elef zuhuvim, even if your living expenses for your household is more than 1,000 gold pieces. Mikol makom chayv litein meiser me harevach. V'rak ma shehaya tzedakah b'hotza. He says, but if part of your living expenses is also tzedakah, kigon shecholak lechem b'sheni v'chamishi, such as you give away bread every Monday and Thursday. And that's part of, when you have your wife bake the bread, she bakes bread for the poor as well, or for the yeshiva bachers. O nasan prutos la'aniyim, or you give away tzedakah to the poor every morning at shacharis. O nasan lechol eze yom livnei talmud Torah, or you feed yeshiva bachrim in your house. O lokach oreach ani al Shabbos o al suda b'yom kederch b'nei Yisrael, yachol enakos mechelak hamaiser. Or if you're feeding guests who need food, right, because they're poor and they wouldn't have a place to eat otherwise, all of that is deductible from your from the amount that you look as profits. So you can deduct all of that before you calculate the 10%. Aval hatzoas banav upnosav haktanim, but the expenses for your children, afal gav the darshinan, and he says your minor children, afal gav the darshinan va'osei tzedakah b'chol eis. Even though the Gemara seems to say that that's a form of tzedakah, but we don't count that as tzedakah as far as making your calculation. The outside hadrash, Amru Chachamenu Zal Kain, Kolomar, Degam Zem Mitzvah. He says, even though our sages seem to say that giving your children food is considered charity, That's only al derech drush. That's not a halachic pronouncement. Aval chalila lachshov ze bichlal tzedakah. The im lo kein laolam lo yagia la'aniyim af pruta achas. He says, because if you were to deduct household expenses, then the poor would never get anything. Va'af ha'megadol b'nei banav u'b'nei b'nosav o b'nosehem nira li she'enu yochol lachshov ze bichlal tzedakah mima'aser. He says, it would seem to me that if you're raising grandchildren, he says that also is not considered to be something that you can deduct as tzedakah. He says, because they're your own kin. He says, Uvnei vanim hareim kabanim, because grandchildren are like your own children. Aval hamegadol yasam v'yasomim mishpachto, o shalom mishpachto, vadai shehu tzedakah gedola, v'yachshav zemi mos meiser. But if you are raising an orphan in your house, then you can certainly count that as tzedakah. V'im huchrach laseis eza tzedakah meruba, shadayin ein berevach shelo kol kach meiser, yochol litenu v'lilvos al smach harevach sheyaviach achar kach, v'az yanaka me'arevach me'hameiser v'yitein lekisa. He says, if, let's say, you want to make a big tzedakah donation one year, but you know it's much more than 10% of what you're going to make this, the profit's going to make this year, you do have a right to, let's say, borrow from your future profits, and you can deduct it. So let's say I want to give a $10,000 gift this year, because there's something really important to me, but I normally would only be giving $5,000 for my profits this year. So what I have to do is, what I can do is I can say this $10,000 gift will count for all the meiser that I'm giving for this year and for next year. So I'm going to, okay, just going to cut and paste. I've got this, and I'll just append that to this piece of literature that we're looking at now. So this is the Aruch HaShulchan.
Rabbi,
Yes.
you talked about here small children and small grandchildren. What about helping out children and family members that are adults that are needing? Would they consider that part of your tzedakah?
Yeah, so I think that the reason why he put this down as your minor children is because that's your obligation, and therefore you cannot use it as a deduction. But if you're dealing with adult children who are already out of your house and you provide for them because they don't have any other sustenance, I think that that also is fair game to be used as tzedakah. And I'm hoping that we'll see that inside explicitly. All right, so we're going to hold it here for today. And Amir